kind of new age of imperialism PowerPoint. This is going to be new information. Yesterday was more or less just a review of what you read on Tuesday, I think. Yeah, that was Tuesday. This is going to be some new stuff. We're going to talk about, the actual act of, going out and doing some empire building. We're going to talk about some of the specific places this happened and the consequences for both, your imperial powers, but also the people that were being colonized. And I think we could say in many cases exploited. Again, imperialism, a dark subject, a lot of racist, kind of greedy activities. But, it's important to know about because it kind of leads us right into the 20th century. So that's what we're doing today. We will continue the PowerPoint tomorrow. We'll probably just do a couple slides tomorrow. Tomorrow is a half day, as you guys are aware. So tomorrow, again, probably a couple slides, maybe a short video. I'm still kind of waiting to see. We're going to see how far we get today. But tomorrow should be pretty laid back. No school on Monday for you guys. Tuesday, we'll get back to it. I'm hoping to wrap this up on Tuesday. It may press a little bit into Wednesday, but we'll just kind of have to wait and see. Again, a lot depends on how much we can get through the next 2 days. Just news and notes, AP exam money. I'm going to say it every day until this time next week, but your final payment is due if you're taking the AP exam. Please have that money in by next Friday. Lots of grades coming up next week. Tentatively, we do have an SAQ over all this age of imperialism stuff next Tuesday. We do have our DCA multiple choice test on Thursday. Looks like it's going to be 26 questions. I'm going to give you a 30-minute time limit. Again, it's open note and whatnot, like everything we've done, but with the time limit that tight, you really can't rely on your notes too much, so study for it. And then on Friday, we are going to do our second notebook check, our final notebook check. Not going to be a whole lot in it, so make sure everything in there is looking good. We also have your extra credit documentary review essay coming up too. So lots of stuff coming up. We're going to try to wrap up grades here pretty soon. Keep putting forth a good effort and get everything you need to get in on time and with some quality work. All right, so where we left off, we kind of talked about the economic, political, and ideological motivations of imperialism. We talked about the idea that, economically, these industrialized nations were trying to get better access to raw materials. They were trying to have a cheap labor force in their colonized countries. We also talked about the desire to open up new markets to sell their goods. Politically, we talked about the forces of nationalism. The idea that this is a time period in which not only a lot of new nation states are being born, but also your older established nation states are really vying for supremacy. They're wanting to be the biggest. They're wanting to be the wealthiest. And one way you could assert yourself on the world stage and kind of proclaim that you were a dominant nation was engaging in imperialism, engaging in empire building. And then finally, we got into the ideological aspects, the really messed up stuff, the racist stuff. Ideas such as social Darwinism, white man's burden, that white Western European descent, at this point in history, were some of your more technologically advanced nations, and they accounted that to the fact that they were white because of their culture. And because of what they said was their racial superiority, that gave them the burden of going out and kind of ruling over everybody else. Now, like we said yesterday, that's a bunch of BS. That's not accurate. It was really all about greed. But this is one of the many ways that these imperial powers justified doing some really messed up stuff. So now we're going to talk about some specific places, and our first stop is going to be in South Asia. The British are going to come up a lot. The British, in almost all areas that undergo this process, have some involvement. This is the time period in which the British become the largest empire in human history. In 1900, that's the British Empire. They've got Canada, they've got Australia, which even to this day are independent nations, but there are some political ties there. They controlled, close to half of Africa, which we'll get into later. Their other really big spot is South Asia, being modern day India, Pakistan, and I believe Bangladesh. So let's talk about how that all got started. And we kind of previewed this a while back. The British had been, at least to some extent, in India for a very long time at this point. This is a time period they take it all over. In India, the British East India Company had established a commercial relationship with the Mughal Empire starting in the 17th century. We've mentioned the British East India Company before. They were a joint stock company. Remember, in that initial phase of overseas colonization, connected to the Columbian Exchange and Age of Exploration, oftentimes it was a joint stock company that went overseas and actually set up the colonies. They worked for the government. The government had invested into them. They owned part of the company. But joint stock companies in these days, they were the ones actually setting up the colonies. At the time, and this is late 1500s, early 1600s, the Portuguese and the French also had a presence there. We had talked previously about the Portuguese trading post empire in the Indian Ocean. However, as Britain's economic and political influence grew, they were eventually pushed out. Again, as time passed, especially once we get into the 1700s and the British become the first true industrial power, they were able to edge out the competition. They were able to edge out a lot of those other Europeans that had also kind of posted up in India, trying to profit, trying to dominate trade in their respective regions. Soon, the British were really the only European game in town. And over years, they gained more power, more influence. As the Mughal Empire weakened, the British East India Company crept further into India, protected by small groups of British soldiers. Eventually, they began recruiting native Indians to join the British colonial army. By the mid-19th century, mid-1800s, sepoys, Indian soldiers employed by the British, composed the majority of British armed forces in India. So you got to look at the context of the time. The Mughal Empire, this Muslim empire, controlled most of India. Not all of it, but most of it. They were never really, loved by the public because, the rulers there under the Mughals were Muslims. The majority of the people, though, were Hindus. So there was a natural animosity there based on their, religious differences. Then the British show up and they start, kind of constructing their own trading posts. But as time passes on, there's areas along the coast, there's areas deeper inland where the British, they're giving people jobs. They're buying and selling goods. They're hiring people to work for them, soldiers to protect them. After a while, the British, they've got a lot of economic influence at the least. Some local Indians start depending on the British. And all the while, the Mughal power is waning. Problem is, the sepoys were not seen as equals. There's still all those ideas of racism. And because of a variety of factors, eventually the sepoys rebel in 1857. The Sepoy Rebellion, the Sepoy Mutiny, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, it has a few different names. This conflict, where Indian soldiers of Britain are rebelling against the British, it's ultimately the thing that leads to the British taking over all of India. It becomes kind of their justification. So the Sepoy Mutiny is something you really need to know about because that's what leads to India becoming a British colony in total. Now, I've got a slide or two on this, but we are going to watch our first little video clip of the day. It's a pretty good one. They're going to get into the Sepoy Mutiny, how it happened, why it happened, and why it was so, influential on India's future history. For Indians, not necessarily in a good way. For the British, this is something that allowed them to take full control. So pay attention, stay awake, all that good stuff. You got your headphones in, if you could turn those down or actually turn them off. I appreciate that. I'm hearing some music in the background. I'm ADHD, it distracts me. But pay attention. You don't necessarily got to take notes because I'm going to hit the high notes on the next slide. But definitely pay attention because there's some really good information here. And the Sepoy Mutiny is something that you do need to know about. Again, it's one of those consequences of European imperialism. I mean, just because Europeans and Americans went in and took over territory, it doesn't mean sometimes people didn't try to fight back. They just ultimately usually weren't very successful. Here we go. This one's pretty good.
How should we describe the events that occurred in India in 1857? William Dalrymple's view is that while the term mutiny is too narrow, War of Independence is also too wide. Most historians tend to agree that rebellion is suitable, but what's actually happened? The British East India Company, formed in 1600, set up outposts in India to trade in textiles and spices for the home market. As their influence grew, they fought a number of battles with the Indians and the French to secure hegemonic power over the subcontinent. This culminated with a British victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which secured the company's monopoly over India. Fast forward 100 years and discontent is growing, taxes are rising, and land rights are being denied to itinerant tribes who turn to banditry in protest. The word thug comes from the Indian Tughi, the name for these bandits, and the Hindi word for deceit. Also, land meant for mosques and temples was being taken for churches, and native peoples were concerned rightly that the British meant to convert them to Christianity. Interestingly, as British power increased, so did segregation between the British and the natives. Early on in the East India Company's history, British officers often became Indianized and were moved and influenced by Indian culture, such as the tolerant religious pluralism advocated by the great leader Akbar centuries before. But as the British began to dominate, all of this changed. In 1780, 1 in 3 East India employees married Indian women, while in 1820, this figure dropped to 1 in 7. This growing oppression is the backdrop over which the events of 1857 began. This is the Enfield P53 rifle, and to load it, it required that the user bite the new paper cartridges to release the bullet and gunpowder. The problem was that these new cartridges were greased with beef and pork fat, which of course was hugely offensive to the Hindu and Muslim sepoys who were hired by and fought for the company. This discontent led to a young sepoy officer, Mangal Pandey, who is now a national hero, shooting at his officer and consequently being executed. Gradually, as this news and the discontent spread, sepoys mutinied in Cawnpore, Lucknow, Jhansi and Meerut, among others, with the sepoys of Meerut marching 40 miles to Delhi, the seat of the last Mughal emperor, the aging Bahadur Shah Zafar II. The revolt spread throughout the city, and Europeans and Christian Indians were slaughtered. The Shah, being emperor only in name, was reluctant at first, but accepted the sepoys' pleas for leadership, and Delhi was secured. Of course, the rebellion was short-lived, as British troops were brought in from the Crimean War and from China, slowly marching on Delhi, killing many along the way. They set up a base outside the city and besieged the city for almost 3 months, while much of that time being heavily on the defensive themselves. At times, it seemed like the British might have to withdraw until reinforcements arrived from the Punjab, where Sikhs had no intention of supporting the Mughal emperor. The city was eventually recaptured along with Bahadur Shah, whose sons were immediately killed and himself sent to exile. Many were murdered in retaliation, and many executed by cannon, as was Mughal tradition. Similar events occurred across the country. The rebellion lasted over 2 years in total, but reaction was swift, and the East India Company was dismantled by the British government, who took direct control over the subcontinent. and it wouldn't be until 1947, almost 200 years later, that India would finally see independence.
And we will talk about that as well. You guys have probably heard of Mahatma Gandhi. I got a picture of him right back there. He's one of the leading figures of the independence movement that ends up, actually working. But it takes quite some time. In fact, if it hadn't been for World War II, who knows if that would even come to pass. I mean, you gotta just imagine this and try to put yourself in the Indian mindset. And really, we could extend this to people in Africa, people, all over in colonized lands. These Europeans come in, the British or whoever, and all of a sudden, you're a second-class citizen in your own home. You're seen as kind of scum. You're not treated well. You're not treated equally. They're the outsiders coming in, but automatically you go to the bottom of the barrel. I mean, that's got to build a lot of animosity. And even though, after several years, many Indians depended on Britain for their livelihood, for their jobs, there was always that animosity there, and people were bound to rebel. So definitely got to know about the Indian Rebellion of 1857. I would definitely write that down. It will come up again. It's also sometimes interchangeably known as the Sepoy Mutiny because, again, the Sepoys were the Indian soldiers that worked for the British. So just kind of an overview. Why did it happen? Well, there had been animosity building, but a rumor starts to circulate that Indian soldiers would be forced to use rifle cartridges that were greased with the fat of pigs and cows. These Indians are largely either Hindu, that would be the majority, or Muslim, the minority. And this is something that would be greatly offensive to both. As we talked about much earlier in the year, Hindus find the cow to be very sacred to them. The cow gives its milk freely and nourishes others, and it's honored and respected in India. I mean, to this day, cows walk on the street. You just stop and wait for them to go by. Pigs, on the other hand, there's a lot of different groups that don't like pigs because they are very, very filthy animals. In Islam, in particular, devout Muslims don't partake in eating pigs. So, this is at the very least insulting, to use these sort of materials when that people of different faiths are going to find it demeaning. I mean, it's almost like the British just didn't care. And they didn't. They looked at the Indians, the people that worked for them, the people whose land they were trying to take over, as beneath them. Again, it gets back into those ideas of white man's burden, of social Darwinism, of just, racist attitudes in general. Again, it's pretty disgusting when you think about it. Convinced that the British were trying to convert them to Christianity, which they probably were, and offended by the persistent lack of respect of native culture, rebellion quickly spread over northern India. The British response was brutal, not only resulting in the deaths of approximately 800,000 Indians, just let that sink in for a second, but also convincing Britain to take a more active role in governing India. Again, up to this point, they had been ruling there in certain territories through the British East India Company. Now they realized, with this uprising that, they needed to more directly control India, not just some of it, but all of it. Because of his perceived role in the mutiny, the last Mughal emperor was imprisoned and exiled, marking the end of the empire. The Mughals have been in power in India for several hundred years at this point. But this is how they end. This is the British excuse to remove them once and for all. The war also marked the end of the British East India Company altogether. After the uprising, the British government ruled India directly and formally as a colony. From 1858 until Indian independence in 1947, the British Raj, I would write that down, the British Raj, the colonial government, took its orders directly from the British government in London. If you hear the Raj or the British Raj, just think of that as the time period when India was completely colonized by the British, completely ran by the British. I mean, you look at this mutiny, it's like, well, of course they would rebel. They had the right to rebel. You guys are the invaders. You guys are demeaning them. But the British, they were especially brutal in their response because, you know, they were trying to scare people into submission. They talked about it in the video, but the method of execution of some of the leaders of the rebellion was especially brutal, and you could even say theatrical. They would actually strap people to the fronts of cannons and fire the cannon. Now, just for a second, just try to imagine what that would do to somebody. I mean, literally, they're going to explode. There's going to be body parts and blood and guts and everything everywhere. And for the people that were watching, you know, and I'd imagine, you know, large populations of just, you know, everyday Indians, this would scare the heck out of them. It would scare them into submission. It would say, hey, you will never rebel again. That's why they did it. It wasn't so much to punish these particular people. That was part of it. But I think part of it was also the psychological effect. And that's probably the worst part about all of this. You know, not only were they justified or justifying doing this through their racist beliefs, or at least the racist things that they were, you know, throwing out there as propaganda, but also when people did try to stand up for themselves, they were so violent, so brutal that they scared those that were left into submission. I mean, it's disgusting, really. But this whole process of imperialism, kind of disgusting. So that's India. We'll get back to India. We will talk about, you know, how they finally achieved their independence. We'll do that when we talk about the big wave of decolonization that happens after World War II. Most of these places that we're going to be talking about do not get their independence until after World War II. That's kind of the major conflict that prompts a lot of these empires to break up. And I said it yesterday, one of the reasons is, you know, we fought against the Nazis and the Japanese because they were building empires. Well, after the war, we kind of had to give up, and I say we as in the West, you know, Western Europe and the United States, we had to give up some of our stuff too, because otherwise it would kind of make us look hypocritical. Next, we're going to look at Southeast Asia. Today, places like Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. Back then, it looked quite a bit different. Now, we'll talk about how the U.S. gets involved there. The U.S. does, for a time, have colonies here in the Philippines, but we're mainly going to be looking at the French and the Dutch because they were some of the main forces. The British had some territory in modern-day Myanmar, Burma back then. You look at, you know, there were some independent states that managed to maintain their independence, but probably the French and the Dutch had the largest amount of territory. So let's talk about the Dutch first. And I'm going to go ahead and go all the way through it because, well, I want my pictures up because it looks weird without them. If you recall, the Dutch, even back in our initial phase of colonization, Indonesia was their spot. And at this time, it was still their spot. Indonesia just had not gained their independence even at this point in the 1800s. So in this age of imperialism, in this new age of imperialism, it's like the Dutch went out and got a lot of new stuff, but what they had, they wanted to hold on to because they saw the profit there. Dutch mariners arrived in modern-day Indonesia, then called the Spice Islands in the 16th century. Back then, very, very valuable territory as the spice trade was incredibly lucrative. That's one of the reasons Columbus was trying to get to this side of the world anyway. I mean, spices, big-time luxury good. The Dutch set up a trading post to monopolize the trade in cloves and nutmeg, valuable spices exclusive to the islands. Through the Dutch East India Company, what do you know? Another joint stock company. These extracted spices became wildly popular in Europe, making a lot of money for the Dutch. However, rampant corruption caused the company to go bankrupt by 1800, at which point the Dutch government took direct control of the Dutch East Indies, very similar to what the British did in India. By the mid-1800s, the islands were also producing cash crops, such as tea, rubber, and sugar for export. This severely limited rice cultivation and eventually created enormous hardship for Indonesian farmers who relied on rice cultivation to survive. It's kind of what we talked about yesterday. You know, these colonizing countries, these, in this case, European countries, they went to territories, they looked at the resources there, they looked at the farmland, they looked for any way that they could make money. Well, you're in a tropical climate. Okay, what can we grow here? Sugar. Sugar's always very valuable. Tea, good cash crop, amongst others. Well, now all of a sudden, the people of Indonesia, rather than farming the land, for their own sustenance, to provide them food, are forced to dedicate the majority of their land to cash crops. Now all of a sudden, they can't grow enough food for themselves. Where are they going to get their food? Well, probably from the Dutch. So this, on one hand, kind of ruins a lot of Indonesia's farmland for agriculture, but also it's going to make the people of Indonesia more dependent on the Dutch. It's one of the reasons they were able to keep this colony for so long. Indonesia would remain a Dutch colony until 1945. What do you know? The year World War II ended, declaring independence shortly after the Second World War under nationalist leader Sukarno, Indonesia's first president. We'll talk about Sukarno a little bit later on. This is more of a preview, as is what we're going to talk about with Southeast Asia. Not that this wasn't part of Southeast Asia, but we're going to talk about the French in Southeast Asia. With a weakened China, France was able to gain control of what is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos by the 1890s. Those modern countries combined to form what was then called French Indochina, because it was near China and Indonesia, and I guess the French didn't have a more creative name for it. You got to remember, a lot of Southeast Asia historically had kind of been under the tributary system with China. China had been the top dog in the region, and while it wasn't like formally colonized by China, they had a lot of sway there. Well, with China going through its own issues in the 1800s and being really close to falling apart altogether, the French used this as an opportunity to swoop in and directly colonize this portion of Southeast Asia. Similar to the Dutch, the French desired valuable cash crops produced in these colonies, such as rubber. French control of these territories continued until shortly after World War II. In 1945, this is important, a nationalist and communist leader named Ho Chi Minh declared independence for the northern portion of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist. He had been leading the movement for independence of what is now Vietnam for many, many years. After World War II, or not World War II, World War I, he went to Europe and wanted to meet with our president at the time period, Woodrow Wilson, because there was talk about colonies gaining their independence, and he waited and he waited, and our president and the other European leaders refused to ever talk to him. He went back home dejected. He went back home knowing that, the West was never going to help. So when World War II ended, he used this as his opportunity. He declares independence for the northern portion of Vietnam. That's the area he had the most support. Now that in and of itself, hey, okay, I get it. You're a nationalist. You want your own country. The problem is he's a communist. And we haven't quite gotten to this yet. We've talked about the basics of communism. But you may be aware that, after World War II, it's the United States and the communist Soviet Unions that are the superpowers. We're the guys left standing. We're the ones that are by far the most powerful countries in the world. In the West, in the United States, we're all about capitalism. We're all about democracy. Over in the Soviet Union, they were all about communism, and you could say a totalitarian style of government. Completely different mindsets about how to run things. They were afraid we were going to take over the world because for a little bit, we were the only people that had atomic bombs, nuclear weapons. We were afraid that they were going to try to take over the world with their crazy communist ideas. That's what starts the Cold War, of which the Vietnam War will be at least one part. Guys, this is why we went to Vietnam. Had nothing to do with people's freedom, had nothing to do with helping the people there. We didn't want them to become communists because we thought if they became communist, other countries would follow suit in the region. The French fought to retain their colony. They didn't want to give Vietnam up, but Vietnamese resistance was fierce. The French called on the United States to help them, which we did out of fear that the whole of Southeast Asia would fall to communism. Eventually, the French lost their interest, if I could talk, to their Southeast Asian colonies. Eventually, the French go home, but we stay behind. Because again, our fear of the spread of communism was so strong that we were going to keep fighting because we just couldn't let that happen. This was the beginning of the Vietnam War, 1964 to 1973, one of the least popular conflicts in American history. Vietnam would not become fully independent and united until after the war in 1973. It was one of the few wars in American history that we lost. We could have stayed there probably forever. We definitely had the money, we definitely had the weapons, but it was kind of a war of attrition. They just outlasted us. After a while, public sentiment had turned so far against the war that we decided to leave. And Vietnam does become fully communist. And then Cambodia became communist as well, but it pretty much stopped there. There wasn't like a massive spread of communism like we feared there would be. Yes. Yeah, go ahead. So that's more of a preview of where we're going, but I'm telling you, all this stuff, imperialism, colonialism, it ties to so many things that we're going to be talking about moving forward. Remember the name Ho Chi Minh, remember kind of the basics of Vietnam and you know, how and why they wanted their independence, because they are going to be important later. Now we move on to Africa. Guys, by 1914, this is Africa. 1914 is when World War I starts. Really, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, and we'll talk about why they managed to stay independent, every other part of Africa gets colonized. You look at the different colors there. Those are all European countries that were running the show from, you know, the late 1800s all the way until the mid 1900s, because most of African nations don't get their independence until after World War II as well. This is what we call the scramble for Africa. And you look at Africa today and you see it's kind of a jigsaw puzzle, you know, how the country borders are organized. Guys, those are still a lot of European imposed borders that were drawn arbitrarily based on resources, based on negotiation. I mean, it doesn't look the exact same anymore. You know, nationalism, some new countries were created, some areas split apart. But one of the reasons that the borders of Africa look so strange goes back to this time period. So why Africa? That's what we're going to talk about today, because out of all of the areas on Earth, it was definitely the area most affected. And I think if you look historically, especially by Europeans and Americans, Africa has consistently been exploited, Africa and its people. We talked about the devastation of the transatlantic slave trade. Well, by the time you get to the mid-1800s, the slave trade's done, but it doesn't mean that there wasn't still interest in Africa, in making money off of Africa. It doesn't mean that a lot of those racist attitudes didn't still persist. Okay, Africa is going to have a rough go of it. They're going to have years and years of exploitation. And you look at various parts of Africa today, they're still recovering from this. So let's look at the why. As I said, Europe had a long-standing relationship with Africa due to the transatlantic slave trade. Although most European countries had declared the importation of slaves from Africa illegal by the early 1800s, Europeans continued to export guns, alcohol, and factory goods to Africa and import African natural resources. It was only a matter of time before the Europeans wanted more. Africa, despite high levels of poverty today, had and has an abundance of natural resources. things back then and today that were very valuable. These are just some examples: copper, cotton, rubber, ivory, palm oil, cocoa, diamonds. There's more diamonds in Africa than anywhere else. Gold, tea, tin, petroleum. This was an untapped area that up to this point, even though Europeans had explored the coastline and claimed some territory, but definitely interacted with some in very negative ways, the interior of Africa, largely unexplored heading into the 1800s, largely unknown. Some of the animations are weird on this. I don't know what happened. Again, you even look at Africa today, and I mean, there's some very valuable things there. Unfortunately, in recent times, political corruption, a lack of manufacturing capability, a lot of times, the countries that still have these things, the government kind of corrupt, takes the resources for themselves while the people suffer. Again, everywhere in Africa is a little bit different. Some countries are doing just fine. Others are really, really struggling. That's not all because of European imperialism, but some of it definitely is. During the early 1800s, European presence in Africa was minimal. Dutch immigrants had established the first European colony in South Africa. They're known as the Afrikaneers. Eventually, the British show up there when they find gold and diamonds and kick most of the Dutch out, even though some Dutch remained. The French were in Algeria pretty early, 1830. That's on the northern coast of Africa, and it wasn't super significant, but they did have some settlers living there. But it's not really till the second half of the 19th century that European nations expand their presence in Africa. A lot of that had to do with technology. Okay, you got to remember, the Portuguese had a presence in Africa very early on. They had trading posts. I wouldn't say full-on colonies at that time, but they had trading posts along the coastline. They knew more about African civilizations than just about anybody else. Unfortunately, they used that knowledge to help them start the transatlantic slave trade. As years progress, you do see some other Europeans kind of, delve into Africa, but it's mainly along the coast, the Dutch, the British in South Africa, the French in Algeria. One of the reasons was they couldn't. Technology, transportation in particular, wasn't good enough, in the 1700s and even in the early 1800s to get very far. You wanted to have a steamship, hard to transport a lot of horses over there. And even if you did, all the horses and the people would die because Africa had tropical diseases of which, Europeans really had no immunity to, especially malaria. But as time progressed, industrial revolution, advancements are made, transportation gets better, medicine gets better, and Africa starts to open up. These are some of the things that helped, Europeans get into Africa. You had the development of quinine, which was one of the first medicines to treat malaria. You had explorers that were willing to go in and kind of map the terrain. For decades, Europeans went in, and kind of mapped the terrain, met the tribes, saw what resources were there. Basically, they're getting technology, or not technology. They were getting information. They were gathering intelligence for later colonization efforts. Better military technology. I mean, by the time you get to the mid-1800s, you've got machine guns going against locals who have little to no firearms at all. The steamship's a big one. With the steamship, Africa has a lot of rivers. And if you can get a steamship, going up these rivers, it's a whole lot easier to get further and further inland than it would be in the past with a sailboat. You got a better chance of going in and actually getting out. And once, territories were more or less taken over, building a railroad helped to connect control of those territories. So again, technology, the Industrial Revolution itself made it easier for Africa and other places to get conquered. One of the big things that kind of starts the competition for Africa is the construction of the Suez Canal. Europeans had long dreamed of shortening the route to Asia by connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Financed primarily by the French, the Suez Canal was constructed in 1869 using Egyptian conscripted labor. As many as 1.5 million unpaid workers were forced to work on the project, with thousands dying over the course of 10 years. In 1882, Great Britain took control over Egypt, still nominally a part of the Ottoman Empire, because of unrest there that threatened British interests. Basically, there was an uprising. And, by that point, the Suez Canal had been very, very valuable. I mean, this way, Europeans didn't have to go all the way around Africa anymore. They just went through the Red Sea. And considering that the British at this point had already colonized India, they couldn't afford for this canal to get shut down. So they used that as an excuse to seize the territory entirely. That's when other European powers started looking at this and saying, hey, we want a piece of Africa too. You start to see the French, you start to see the Italians, the Germans, the Belgians, seeing what the British were doing and wanting a piece of Africa for themselves. We got one more slide and then a very, very short video. Guys, this is what starts what we call the scramble for Africa. European powers soon engaged in a scramble for Africa, 1870 to 1890, during which most of Africa came under their control. To avoid wars over territory, European nations began to meet and discuss how to divide Africa. You definitely need to know this name. It's something I alluded to earlier, 1884, the Berlin Conference. You got all these rich white European dudes sitting in a ballroom, drinking and smoking cigars and breaking out maps of Africa, deciding how to divide it up amongst themselves. They didn't care what Africans thought. Again, they looked down on Africa and its people. They just didn't want to have to fight each other, at least not yet. Through warfare and diplomacy, Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, all established colonies in Africa over the next 20 years. By 1912, only 2 of Africa's nations remained independent. Ethiopia, which was already a Christian nation and were able to kind of escape outright colonization, and Liberia, which kind of sort of was an American colony. We'll talk about Liberia and its history because it's really messed up tomorrow. But to close out, I do have a very short video. It's only like 3 or 4 minutes. But it kind of goes over the scramble for Africa. It talks about, or at least introduces some of the impact of the Europeans coming in and largely taking over the continent. Again, it's really messed up. Just because slavery had been abolished pretty much everywhere at this point, it doesn't mean Africans weren't treated deplorably. And in some cases, borderline were treated as slaves. So let's watch this. It's a quick one. And then we'll call it a day. And we'll pick up where we left off tomorrow. Probably won't do a whole. All right, here we go. Maybe. Rewind it. What's going on? I had this working earlier.
In the late 1800s, imperialist European nations gained control over much of Africa. Imperialism is the
Oh, come on. Worst comes to worst, we may be watching this tomorrow. It's like 2 minutes. Get it done. Let's see. See if we can make this work.
In the late 1800s.
Okay, so we're going to watch this tomorrow. We'll get it figured out. Or actually, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I still got enough time. I got a plan B. You don't worry about that. Mr. Brown's gonna get this situated.